Good morning, everyone. We are in Maseches Ma'aser Sheni, and we are on Perek Aleph, Chapter 1, Mishna Dalid, Mishna 4. Okay. Now, some of the cases in this Mishnah are going to be different than the case of the Mishnah before. The Mishnah before was talking about buying something edible and something not edible comes along. That's what's going to happen here too, but we're going to see the differences in these cases. If you buy a chaya, a non-domestic animal, for a shlomim carbon, like you buy a deer for the purposes of using it for a carbon shlomim, and you can't do that. You cannot bring a carbon from a non-domestic animal. Carbon sacrifice only comes from cows, sheep, and goats, not from chayas, not from non-domestic animals like a deer. But that's what you did. You used the Ma'aser Sheni money, and you bought a chaya for zivchei shlamim. Yesterday's case is you bought a behema. You bought the animal for a shlamim, which is perfectly good. And the Mishnah there said that in that case, the animal's meat is going to be the sanctity of the Ma'aser Sheni money will transfer onto the meat of the animal, not onto the skin. Because the skin, you're not buying the animal for the skin, you're buying it for the meat. The skin just comes along. In this case, you're buying an animal you can't even use for a carbon with the Ma'aser Sheni money. Or or use the Ma'aser Sheni money to buy, a domestic animal meat, but not for the sacrifice purpose, just for the sake of eating meat. Now that the Mishnah says, Lo yatsa ha'ar l'chulin. In those cases, the skin is not considered chulin, not considered not sanctified. Now, it's a little misleading, this wording, but what the wording here means like this. In both these cases that we just said, you bought a chaya, non-domestic animal for a sacrifice, or you bought, domestic animal meat, but not for the purpose of using it you bought the cow, not for the purpose of using it as sacrifice, but just to slaughter its meat. In both cases, the sale doesn't take place. Meaning the whole idea of making a sale and thus transferring the money, the kedusha, the sanctity onto the money that we used to redeem the Ma'aser Sheni produce onto this animal, it doesn't work at all. You cannot make a chaya, cannot be a sacrifice. If you use Ma'aser Sheni money to buy a chaya for a sacrifice, it's not going to work. There's nothing happening. Any money for that. So no transaction happened. Nothing happens. Everything stays the same. That's why when the Mishnah says lo yatsa l'chulin, the chulin doesn't go out does not become unsanctified. Really doesn't mean it doesn't become unsanctified. It just means that nothing happens to it. Nothing happens to the animal. The animal just stays the way it is because of the fact that nothing happened. No transaction, no transfer even took place. And the same thing when we talk about you bought the animal for basar taiva. Now, what's the problem here? Why here is there no transaction made when you're buying the meat from basar taiva just to buy the meat for eating purposes, just for regular eating purposes? There's nothing wrong with that. Seemingly, you're using the Ma'aser Sheni money for food. What's the problem? So there was a special law that was instituted by the sages in the following way. As we mentioned yesterday, the ideal way of using Ma'aser Sheni money is to buy an animal to use it for a sacrifice, for a shlomim, which is a sacrifice that we eat from. That's the ideal way of using the Ma'aser Sheni money. At the same time, if you want to use it for regular meat, you could. So the sages originally said it's okay to use it for regular meat, which would be the letter of the law. But then they saw that people were just buying the meat, meaning domestic animal meat, for the purposes of eating and not bringing it as a sacrifice. And because people weren't bringing it as weren't using it for sacrifice, they were typically not doing it for a sacrifice. The sages said, behema meat, domestic animal meat, you cannot use it for anything but a shlomim. Since people were not using the meat they were not using it for shlomim, they were just using it for regular meat. The sages instituted, you cannot use the Ma'aser Sheni money for regular meat. And if you cannot use it for regular meat, then it's not going to work. So therefore, in both of these cases, the first case of the Mishnah, which is you bought chaya meat for a carbon, or you bought cow meat, let's say, for regular meat, in both those cases, the whole transaction doesn't work. And that you cannot use the Ma'aser Sheni money for this. If you can't use the Ma'aser Sheni money for it, then nothing happened. No transfer takes place, and therefore everything just stays the same. The money stays the same. The animal stays the same. Now, next case. Kade Yayin Psuchais. If we are now talking about, now the case is like this. Kade Yayin Psuchais Stumais. You bought jugs of wine that were open or sealed in a place where the way they're typically sold is open. Yesterday's Mishnah was talking about where you bought these jugs of wine in a place where they are bought in sealed jugs. Here we're talking about you're buying these pitchers with the wine in a place where typically the wine is sold at open pitchers, which typically you don't take the pitcher along. The pitcher is open. They measure it out. They put it into some kind of vessel of yours, whatever it may be, and that's how you take the wine home. Got to, of course, have it in some kind of vessel. But the vessel typically is not the jugs that they're sold from. But you went ahead and you did take the Ma'aser Sheni money, and you said to this person, you're buying the jug and you're buying the wine. So now, so in yesterday's Mishnah, where the jug typically comes along with the wine, we said the jug doesn't become sanctified because the primary sale is the wine, and the jug just comes along because it always comes along. But here, the jug doesn't typically come along. So here, where it is coming along, that means that your purchase, you're using Ma'aser Sheni money not only for the wine, but for the jug. And therefore, and here the Mishnah says, Lo yatsa kankan l'chulen. Here, the jug does not remain unsanctified. Now the jug will become sanctified because it's being purchased with the wine, but it's not just coming along with the wine. It's actually being purchased with the wine with the Ma'aser Sheni money, because in this place, jugs typically don't come along with the wine. So therefore, in this case, it comes out that your purchase was the wine and the jug. The Ma'aser Sheni money was used to buy the jug. Therefore, the jug does take on the sanctity of the Ma'aser Sheni money. And now what you're going to have to do is take that jug, sell it, so that now the money that the sanctity from the jug transfers onto, you'll now use that money to buy food, because you're not supposed to use the money for a jug. You're supposed to use the money for a food. Being that you use it for the jug, we now say the jug does take on the sanctity, but you got to redeem it. You got to transfer the sanctity from the jug onto the money, and then onto other money, and now use that other money for buying food. Now, there's an obvious question that we have to ask, and that is that in the case of the animal that could not, let's say the case of a chaya, you bought the chaya, but Ma'aser Sheni money to use it as a carbon, but you can't. You can't do that. You can't do it at all. You can't ever do such a thing. You can't use a chaya for a carbon. So therefore we said, the Ma'aser Sheni money, nothing happens. None of the sanctity transfers onto the animal. Here, we're talking about the jugs. You cannot use Ma'aser Sheni money to buy jugs. So why here do we say that the jugs do get the sanctity, and you got to sell the jugs and now go ahead and use the money of the jug that you sold the jugs for to now use that for money? Why aren't we just saying that when the wine becomes sanctified and the jugs don't? You can't use the money for the jugs, so it shouldn't work for the jugs. If I can't use Ma'aser Sheni money to buy jugs, and here also, when I buy the jugs, the Ma'aser Sheni money shouldn't have any effect on the jugs. It shouldn't have any effect on the jugs. So the answer is that being here, there by the case of the animals that we said in the first half of the Mishnah, the sale doesn't work on anything. Here, you're buying the jug with the wine. The sale on the wine does work. The Ma'aser Sheni money does work to purchase the wine, and thus transfer the sanctity from the money onto the wine. Since the jug is being sold together with the wine, and the sale of the wine does work the Ma'aser Sheni money, then it works for it works for the jug also. Once the Ma'aser Sheni money works for the wine, which of course it would, it'll work for the jug that's being purchased together with it. That's the difference. Before, nothing worked. Here, you're buying it with the wine. where it did work for the wine, and therefore it works for the jug too. Now, next case in the Mishnah. Saleh zeisim v'saleh anavim imakli. Baskets of olives, baskets of grapes with the vessel. That's the purchase. You're purchasing the grapes and the basket. Lo yatsu dmei hakli l'chulin. The value of the kli of this money, of this Ma'aser Sheni money, does not go to chulin. That means like this. When you go ahead and you, let's say you have the Ma'aser Sheni money and you buy the Ma'aser Sheni money, you buy the meat with, the wine with, and that of course works. So the sanctity of the money goes on to the wine. That's what happens. And the sanctity goes off the money. The money is not sanctified anymore. Do with what you want. In this case, though, we say like this. You bought with Ma'aser Sheni money the olives and the basket. Says the Mishnah. The value of the olives, of course, the money works for. And that amount of money, that amount of value of this money, the sanctity has come off of. But the amount of money that's being used to buy the basket, which is the value of the basket, that amount of money of this money that was used does not become chulin. It does not have the sanctity of the Ma'aser Sheni transferred off of it. So if you bought this basket and the olives for for X amount of price, and again, the baskets do not typically go along with the olives. That's the point here. It's not like the other cases we had before in the previous Mishnah. The baskets are not sold with the olives, but you bought the basket with the olives with the Ma'aser Sheni money. So the value of the olive, and so therefore your money that you Ma'aser Sheni money, X amount went for the olives, X amount went for the basket. The amount that goes for the olives, which is the value of the olives, that amount is going to be that amount of the of the money of the Ma'aser Sheni money. That amount now the sanctity of the Ma'aser Sheni goes off of it. It becomes chulin. But the amount of money that is of the basket that doesn't come off. That the sanctity of the Ma'aser Sheni money the sanctity of the Ma'aser Sheni still stays on that money, because that amount of money which was used towards the basket doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. That's the point. It doesn't work at all. When you're buying the olives in the basket, the amount of Ma'aser Sheni money that's the value of the olives, that works. In that case, the money now, that sanctity of the money transfers onto the olives and off of the money, but only that much money, which is the value of the olives. But the amount of money that's the value of the basket, used to purchase the basket, that doesn't work at all, because you can't use Ma'aser Sheni money for a basket. So that didn't work at all. If it didn't work at all, then that amount of money still has the sanctity of the Ma'aser Sheni. Now, obviously, we need to explain now the difference between this case and the previous case. In the case of the flasks, the jugs with the wine, we say that since the transfer and the purchase worked for the wine, it worked for the jug. So the sanctity went onto the jug and off the money, and you have to take the jug and sell it and use that money for food. Here we don't say that. Here we say the purchase worked for the olives. The saying that amount of the value of the olives, that amount is of that amount of the money, the sanctity of Ma'aser Sheni goes off and goes onto the olives. But the amount used to purchase the basket, that we say nothing happens there. Why? What's the difference? The purchase worked for the olives. You're selling that basket. You end up buying the basket with the olives. Why didn't it work for the basket also, like it worked for the jug with the wine? And the explanation is the following. The explanation is because in the case of the jug and the wine, you have to have something to bring the wine home in. You can't take the wine and put it in your pocket. You got to have something. Now, typically people, I guess, brought some kind of their own vessels, and the wine was measured out of the jugs and given to you. In this case, you bought the jug. But the jug now is your carrying vessel for the wine. You have to have it for the wine. You can't just carry the wine by itself. It's got to have something. In this case, that something is the jug. And therefore, once the transfer, the sale and the transfer works for the wine, it'll work for the jug also. That's part of the transaction. Because the wine needs the jug. Therefore, the transaction will work on the jug also, and the sanctity will be transferred onto the jug. When we're talking about olives, you don't need any vessel. you can easily carry it home. Put it in your pocket, hold it in your hand, whatever it is. That's not a big deal to carry by itself. So the basket is not needed for the olives. So that means the basket is a completely separate transaction. In the case of the wine and the jug, it's considered a transaction on the jug because the jugs typically aren't sold. So I'm buying the jug also. It's the back. Since the olives don't need the basket to be able to be carried, so that means now I have two separate transactions. I have a transaction of the olives, I have a transaction of the baskets. A transaction using my Ma'aser to buy a basket doesn't work. And therefore, the value of the basket does not transfer off the money because that amount of the money was never used in any way. Okay. That's the end of the Mishnah. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so the Chavetz Chaim, again, has been dealing with what we call apet lasa, the opinion that there is license to speak Lashon Harah, no prohibition to speak Lashon Harah, I should say, when one of the original listeners would just want to repeat what was said, because he was one of the three originals, he knows it was done in front of three, he knows that this is something that's going to become public knowledge, and therefore there's no prohibition for him to say it. But we said he can only do that not to spread it more, but just to say it. Now, nearly let's say when Reuben spoke Lashon Harah about Shimon in front of three people, okay, the three people were people who were God-fearing people and don't speak Lashon Harah. And this is not going to become something that's to become well known. It's going to be revealed. So now you can't talk to somebody else. When you think about it, right? This whole concept of Abi Klas is just it's very interesting. The whole point is Reuben spoke Lashon in front of Shimon. That we know. The three people, right, who are listening. Now we say, well, any one of them can go ahead and now go ahead and say this over. Why? Because the other two guys are going to spread it. And because it's going to be spread, it's going to become well known. Something become well known is not Lashon Harah. That means you're assuming the other two guys. Now, you're getting your permission, right? Your permission to speak, to say this Lashon Harah is because it's going to get spread by the other two guys. But that means the other two guys are going to speak Lashon Harah. That's the assumption. The assumption is it's going to be said anyway. What do you mean it's going to be said? It's Lashon Harah, isn't it? But it's only based on and the whole permission to do so. The whole reason there's no prohibition is because it's going to get revealed. What is it? The answer is, do you expect them to speak Lashon Harah? The answer is yeah. People speak Lashon Harah. So I look at the other two guys. They're going to speak Lashon Harah. They're going to spread it. Oh, they're going to spread it. So therefore, it's not Lashon Harah for me. And the same argument goes for the other two guys. But it's all based. The starting point is that they're going to speak the Lashon Harah. They're going to spread it. Oh, so they're going to spread it. It's not Lashon Harah for me. It's a very interesting concept. Says the Chavetz Chaim, well, if these three people are people who don't speak Lashon Harah, then the whole thing falls apart. It's not going to be revealed. They don't speak Lashon Harah. Even if one of them is a person who doesn't speak Lashon Harah, the same thing applies. You don't have the three announcers. You don't have the three people who are the three publicizers. At the end, the one person relies on the other two publicizers, but you have to have a total of three publicizers. Let's say when Reuben spoke about Shimon, he spoke about Shimon in front of his relative, in front of his good friend. they're not going to go ahead. The assumption, you can't make an assumption about them. They're going to speak about their friend this way. They're going to spread Lashon about their friend. Same idea. Same idea as the people who won't speak Lashon Hara because it's forbidden to speak Lashon Hara. These people won't speak the Lashon Hara because they don't want to speak it. It's their friend, even if they would speak Lashon about somebody else. But this person is their friend. It's their relative. They're not going to speak. They're not going to spread the Lashon Hara about this person. So I don't have any more of my 3 publicizers. And therefore, this license, so to speak, of Apik Lasa won't apply. Next paragraph, next halacha vav. Oinirli, the Chavetz Chaim says, and also it appears to me, the dafka ba'oiso ir shesham Apik Lasa mutar legalis, mishum dechavra chavra. Only in that city that you heard in front of 3 is permissible. It's permissible to continue. That you can continue speaking, saying over this piece of Lashon Hara, because the whole point is one person, the other people are going to say it, his friend, and eventually it becomes big news. It becomes well known, and therefore it's the kind of thing that's not from the Lashon Hara. But it says the Chavetz Chaim that only works in that city. But not in a different city. You could assume within the same city it'll spread, but to assume that's going to spread to another city, that you can't do. Even though caravans, there's a lot of travel between the two. Nonetheless, to go so far to say that the news is going to be spread, it's going to become well known, even in a different city, that far the Chavetz Chaim says you can't do. So even if we say that it's permissible for you to say this Lashon Hara of 3 and will become well known, that can only be assumed and used within that same city. Then you can assume it'll spread in the city. But to assume that it'll spread in a different city, even though there is travel in between and communication in between, nonetheless, you would not be able to go that far as to say it over in a different city. Have a wonderful day.